everybody, and welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark, and today we are grading Joe Biden. There's no sugarcoating it. Joe Biden is not overwhelmingly popular right now. The latest 538 average puts his approval rating at around 42% and disapproval around 53%. Now, you'd expect your average Fox News viewer, Trump voter, to be mad at him and blame him for all the world's troubles. But you don't get to 42% without losing some of your own people who voted for you. And when you've got a president who's down in the low 40s, that obviously spells trouble for that president's party in the midterms. So today we're going to hear from a mix of Democrats and swing voters. The swing voters, as always, they voted for Trump in 2016, but didn't vote for Trump in 2020. They either voted for Biden or went third party. And we asked them how they're feeling about Biden and the direction of the country more generally. My guest today is Robert Gibbs, President Obama's first White House press secretary and co-host of one of my favorite political podcasts, Hacks on Tap. Robert, thanks so much for being here. It's a real treat for me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this. Always a good excuse to watch focus groups.
Yeah, how was it watching those focus groups?
Well, I will say you got great feedback and very talkative for Zoom focus groups. Lots of interaction, which isn't always the case.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about us doing focus groups is people who listen to this podcast know, or other Bulwark fare, we just do them all the time. It has become such an embedded part of everything we do. And so we've gotten okay at them. So listen, your old boss, President Obama, he occasionally had some stretches of bad polls. And I wonder, just to level set the conversation, what is it like when you feel like you're doing your absolute best and the American people just giving you any love? What's that like?
Yeah, so I think, when the polls are like this, it feels a little bit like you're running in mud. It feels like a bad campaign. It feels like you can't do anything right. It feels like everything is a bit of bad luck. It just doesn't feel good. And I think it makes everybody try a little bit harder. And sometimes that works. And sometimes that just adds to feeling like you're running in mud.
So just to prepare you, we've got a lot of tough medicine for Biden coming from voters in these focus groups, especially the swing voters. And I got to say, it's not that hard to see why Biden is underwater when you listen to the voters. I know some people have been trotting out the dreaded malaise to describe how voters are feeling, but I don't quite think that's it. I think I would use the word precarious. Like, people are just on edge and worried that things could fall apart at any minute. Runaway inflation, World War III, nuclear war, a new COVID variant. You could sort of see why people feel wobbly. We always ask at the beginning kind of a level setting questions like, how do you think things are going in the country? And let's listen to a bunch of these answers.
Well, they're definitely better than they were under Trump. They're better than they were a couple of years ago. I've got some real serious concerns about the future. I don't think our country is going in the right direction.
It's kind of stable, more stable than it has been, and that's nice. But I still think there's a lot of issues that are falling through the cracks.
I feel like we are really headed in a bad direction, and I'm not going to necessarily blame Joe Biden for that. I think things are just not going great. I think we could be doing a lot more.
I think we're in a shitstorm. I don't think really anybody's handled anything well. I think part of that's because everyone's hard-headed.
I feel more insecure at this time in my life than I ever have.
I'm really waiting on tenterhooks to see what happens with the student loan reform / potential cancellation, or at least delays, hopefully, in repayments. Obviously, top of mind is concerns in Ukraine with Russia. But the other thing would be the concerns over the housing market and rising interest rates. I think we're in a neutral, could go either way really quickly. So I've kind of got a wait and see attitude about a lot of stuff right now.
I would agree. I'm neutral, but definitely downtrending.
That is a lot of bad news. That is like a lot of people who feel, again, I'm going to go back to this word precarious, but let's unpack what we just heard. So Republicans have really been hammering Biden with the word weak. And I wonder if that isn't a particularly devastating frame for him when people are looking for someone to lead them through what feels like a state of constant crisis. and anxiety. What do you think when you hear this?
Well, I think a few things. One, I do think this is a question that gets everybody's angst up, right? Democrats and Republicans sort of not feeling like things are going in the right direction. But I do think you heard it in a lot of folks' answers. There's anxiousness, trepidation, worry, concern. And so, I think there's just a lot of anxiety about what the future will hold, what it brings. And it's sort of hard to blame them given what they're watching in the news, the price at the pump, inflation, and things like that.
It's interesting. You ask them like, how are things going in the country? And you get a lot of, for some reason, people don't default to like the rosier picture. I mean, the last, I don't know, year of the Trump administration, the number one thing we heard when we would say, how do you think things are going? Is people would be like, oh, it's a shit show. Am I allowed to swear? It's a shit show. That's what they would always say. But I do think part of the problem is that it's like been going on for a long time. Like people feel exhausted, and like you get a little bit of good news, like COVID maybe pulling back, and then you're just like waiting for everything to fall apart.
Right. To that point, just when you think you make progress, then a war breaks out in Europe, and then someone talks about nuclear weapons, and then gas prices continue to go up. And I do think there's a sort of snowball effect, a compounding impact of all of these problems. And a lot of the group you heard, some felt stable, but some felt like it was getting worse. And so that trajectory is worrisome. To your point on weakness, I do think, and you heard this both from Democrats and swing voters, and that is wanting to see and feel more strength from Joe Biden. That wasn't a surprise to me. I think people on the Democratic side want to see him fighting for their priorities. In the middle, want to see just a bit more forcefulness, whether it's dealing with foreign policy or other things.
That's true. There was a point at which we asked for advice for Joe Biden from the Democrats, and the advice was uniformly sort of be tougher. And I can see him being caught in this, the difference between people kind of wanting him to be the sympathizer in chief, the unity guy, but then also people wanting him to be much tougher and like going on offense and beating up Republicans. And there's a tension there. But inflation is obviously like it has totally replaced COVID in the focus groups as the number one issue that people care about, regardless of political party. So let's hear some of what they're saying about inflation.
We haven't had this kind of inflation in a long time, and it's hitting everybody. It's like an extra tax.
I have a diesel car, and the cost of diesel is like $5.50 a gallon. So I'm not going anywhere unless I absolutely have to at this point.
The inflation is something that is really hitting hard right now. And I don't understand. Nothing seems to be as straightforward as it seems. You think that because of Russia, the oil prices are going up, and I don't really feel that that's true,
That was swing voters. Now let's listen to Dems.
When people talk about inflation, that's another thing that so many people are experiencing in different ways. The CPI is a single statistic that is applied to 365 million people, and it's a basket of goods. So, if someone eats a lot of red meat and drives a lot, then they might really be feeling inflation, whereas if someone is retired in Nebraska and doesn't drive very much, then they have a very different perspective on inflation. And I think that just represents just how different everyone's experience is and like maybe why we're so divided.
You can't deny that our employment numbers are good. Our GDP is good. COVID is certainly better than it was. But yes, we have inflation and gas increases. But if you understand why, then you can at least say, but it is what it is. So we'll get out of it like we always do.
I think the reason that people are tanking the ratings is really they see this big sign 10 feet tall and they pass it and the number keeps going up every day, every time they have to fill up for gas. When they go to the store and, chicken or whatever is almost double the price. Those things scare people. You can't even get a new car if you wanted one. Good luck. You're on a waiting list and it's going to be priced above MSRP, which is crazy.
So here's what I think is interesting about juxtaposing the swing voters with the Democrats in those sound bites. So the Democrats tend to be a bit more analytical about inflation than the swing voters. They don't really blame Biden for it, but they do understand it's a problem, both real and political. And so what do you do about an issue like inflation when you know it's a meteor of political death kind of issue?
Great question. So let me first of all point out you found two people in the world. I didn't have this on my bingo card, either MSRP or CPI, Consumer Price Index. When I heard that, I almost dropped my pen. I was taking notes and I was like, wow. If I'm in the White House, one of the things that I would be pushing for more often is for Biden to be out there talking about prices and talking about things to reduce prices, right? So whether it's releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to bring down gas prices, or the House vote a week or so ago to cap drug prices on insulin. Voters need to hear more from the president and from the administration on what they're trying to do to bring those prices down. Like you, I was struck that there's not universal blame by any means for Biden. They understand he inherited a lot of problems. He's dealing with this now. The challenge for obviously Biden in the White House is come November, they'll be held responsible for it not having gotten better, even if they don't blame him for the original cause. And again, that's why I think flooding the zone with events, comments, speeches, interviews around reducing prices.
Yeah, look, I want to get through a couple of these other clips, but then I want to dig in with you because this communications thing, like this is why I really wanted to have you on, because I think this is the ball game. The point that you just made, look, the Democrats are going to give him the benefit of the doubt to some degree. They're not going to blame him. But like at the end of the day, so much of this is really about like what people are hearing. And we heard a lot of that in the focus groups. But before we jump to the meat of it, this division point. So someone in an earlier clip mentioned people being divided, and people talk about this all the time, regardless of political party. I gotta tell you, voters are super funny. They will like lament how divided we are just before they talk about what a commie fascist asshole like their political opponent is. But they worry about it. It sounds like it's a contributing factor to this sense of fear and precariousness in both groups because they're like, oh man, things could pop off at any moment, get violent. And so Joe Biden, ran on American unity, but let's listen to how voters feel about the polarization right now.
Politics is a pretty heated topic, obviously, but, I feel like it's becoming more and more divisive. And if you don't see like almost eye to eye with someone, the tensions immediately like just go right off the roof. So if you try to talk about it with people,
I think we have huge things we have to solve, but we're being distracted by this, tribalism. People are just going in their respective corners and would rather just point the finger and fight about it than actually solve anything. It's kind of discouraging. And yet I kind of feel the need to protect my guy.
So I feel like the country is very divided, like the very extremes. You're either this way or you're this way. And I feel like nothing can get done. And I can't remember in a very long time when I felt like the country's been so extremely divided that they won't give in either way.
Nobody wants to play together anymore. It's a scary time, very scary, sad time. And be interesting in the history books how the pandemic and all this play out in 20, 30 years. How do we have to have a winner? Do we have to have a loser? I don't know.
Our elected officials are on both sides or on any side are just, I don't know if I can swear on here, but they're just pieces of shit, right? Like they don't want to work together. They have no interest in, coming together, united in a cause, reaching across the aisle. I mean, that's a problem. Then that permeates everything else, right? Like, oh, Biden's president now, I don't want to work with him at all. Same thing that the Democrats did with Trump. He's an a-hole, but does he have some good ideas? It doesn't matter. He's an a-hole. We don't want to work with him. So I think elected officials is the main part of the problem.
So obviously uniting the country was a big part of Biden's pitch.
Right.
Do you think there's more he could be doing on that front? And it's a pretty interesting comms question. This is what we were talking about before. Should Biden be going negative on Trump and showing strength and going after the Trumpy GOP? Or should he be leaning harder into the, healing of the fractured America?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think the challenge, and you hear it in the voices of those participants, is they're bemoaning a lack of progress. They're bemoaning a lack of working together, the divisiveness. I think in many ways, and certainly some of them understand we're in a 50-50 Senate, which makes that change all the more difficult. I think when we combine thinking through how to be a little stronger, my guess and my hunch is that voters more want to see Biden be stronger. And that may mean taking on the Republicans a little bit more. not in a gratuitous way, but I think just a little bit more forcefully around making some progress. Because I think the challenge for Biden is the lack of progress hurts him. The lack of progress doesn't necessarily hurt Republicans that are out of power. And so I think there's a governing strategy. You saw this in the beginning of the Obama administration. You're seeing it now, which is if nothing happens, we're happy to go to the polls in November and play that out if you're a Republican strategist. If you're a Democratic strategist, you want to go to the polls having played out some amount of progress. And if that's being prevented, by definition, Republicans are going to feel better because of it. So I think we're getting to that point, particularly because we're getting to that part of the election season where the White House is going to have to contrast more with what Republicans, in this case, aren't doing if they're going to, I think, get a second look from voters.
Can I push you on this point a little bit, though? Because, I think to some degree, sometimes I think about Biden and I'm like, you know what, Biden, man, you already did the job. You knocked out Donald Trump, and that's really all you had to do. But then, they set the bar so high.
Oh, sure.
They had the barest of majorities, and I feel like they did this to themselves to some degree. He should have leaned into how narrow his majority was, how difficult it was going to be to get anything done. And instead, they put forward, all these big, laundry list voting rights bill and Build Back Better. And everybody's like, well, they didn't get anything done. Right. And if they had just said, boy, we'd be super lucky if we got one bipartisan infrastructure bill passed, they'd just be in a much better situation right now. But maybe I'm being uncharitable. I don't know.
Voters are less focused on what the score was or even what the score is in terms of the makeup of the Senate. They just expect in a world in which Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House that they're going to get things done. That list of expectations is enormous. This is where I think communications comes in. The White House has to level set in the reality and talk to people about the reality of whether or not it's really possible to get a lot of these things done. Voting rights is a great example. I mean, they made a big push on that with the speech in Georgia and then the vote in the Senate, which quite frankly was doomed to fail from the very beginning. It didn't lessen the expectations on the Democratic side that something would happen. And then when it doesn't, there's disappointment. And look, this is the frustrating thing and the challenging thing about governing, but I don't think, to your point, they've done themselves a ton of favors thinking, with 50-50, we can get all of these things done. That was always going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Actually, just one last thing on this, just because it comes up all the time in the focus groups. And somebody mentioned it in one of the earlier clips, which is the student loan forgiveness.
Yep.
Just on one measure, that one, especially among young people, when I talk to Dem groups, nothing comes up more than that. Sure. Are you surprised they haven't moved on kind of a couple discrete things? They've tried to do these big omnibus things, but it feels like if they kind of went on legislative offense on a couple popular things, and I don't know, people seem to expect Biden can just do this by executive order, which I'm not sure if that's true or not, right. But is there a couple things you think they could do going into the midterms that would help?
Yeah. I mean, I look, if I was them, I'd pick a fight on a few of these things, right? So you're not going to get a $3.5 trillion piece of legislation. Get into a fight about a larger prescription drug pricing bill, right? Run the vote on that. Barnstorm a little bit. And look, we should understand and have people understand that the news environment's different than it really has ever been. And it's not easy to drive a message that everybody's going to hear without hundreds of millions of dollars advertising or with a war going on. But I do think getting into a few discrete, smaller fights would be helpful. It would be impactful. It would show, I think, the type of fighting contrast that people expect. Because look, even as he ran as a uniting candidate, he still ran as a contrast to both Donald Trump and to what Republicans were offering. And so I don't think they'd penalize him if he were to do that. I don't think he has to pick between being a Democrat and being a uniter. I think it's about picking the battles that are most important to voters. Right now, that's inflation. Get into a fight about some of these things. Get into a fight about the cost of childcare. I think Democrats, we did this a bit with healthcare in 2009 and 2010. It gets put into something big. It's not easy to explain or understand. and the process gets covered rather than the substance. And I don't know that there's a lot of people that can tell you what's in Build Back Better or what was in that. But I'd sure pick a few of the things that are most popular and get into a fight about them.
Boy, do I agree with that. Okay, let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll just hear a little bit of good news. Are you one of the millions of people who mostly invest in stocks? Because JP Morgan predicts returns for stock-heavy portfolios will be under 5% for the next decade. As a fix, they say that alternative assets are no longer optional. And JP Morgan, Citi, and Morgan Stanley all agree there's one asset in particular you should be looking at: contemporary art. Because they know contemporary art's returns have outpaced the S&P 500 for the last 25 years by a whopping 164%. And it has the lowest correlation to public equities of any major asset class. Now that you know that secret, I can tell you about Masterworks. They let you add contemporary art to your portfolio at a price customized to you with no hassle. If you want to skip their waitlist, just go to masterworks.io and use the promo code Focus Group. That's masterworks.io, promo code Focus Group. Before deciding to invest, carefully review important disclosures at masterworks.io/CD. Now we're back with Robert Gibbs. All right, now look, when it comes to Democratic focus groups, right? We're doing Democrats, we're doing swing voters. The Democrats are much more likely to cut Biden some slack and chalk up the environment to a mess he inherited when he came into office or conditions that are beyond his control. Here's a sample.
I believe Biden inherited just a lot of problems in the country that were not necessarily his fault, but he's getting the brunt of the blame for.
Democrats are like herding cats, so it's hard for him to keep focus with us. And I think we pull him in all these different ways.
Inflation, a lot of that's caused by the pandemic. Gasoline prices, the president doesn't have any power over that.
Based on what he came into when he began his term and where we are now with everything that's happened, I've been very pleased with his decision making.
So those are Democrats kind of saying, hey, look, man, he's got a hard job. This is tough for him. But you know what? The Democrats that are a lock for him, they're not going to decide who wins in 2024. It is these swing voters who voted for Trump in 2016, came across the aisle in 2020 and said, I got to stop the insanity, so I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. He is acceptable. But listen to how they talk about where they put some of the blame.
President Biden's, maybe some of his leadership's been questionable on what he's been doing, what he can get accomplished. He has the House and the Senate tied, so he's got inside track there a little bit, but he can't seem to get his things passed that he wants to, even with some big compromises. I just think that things would be running a little bit smoother in the administrative way of the government, since he's been kind of like a career politician most of his life, knows the ropes.
I think the career politicians that are in Congress are just running it, and he's just a mouthpiece. I mean, I think the presidency for a long time has been like that to some extent, but he is really just a warm body in the seat, and everybody else is doing everything.
I feel like some of it is, it's like the Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Like he's just there, and there are other people pulling the strings and doing everything, and he's just the figurehead.
Here's that word again. This comes through in all the focus groups, especially with these swing voters who they voted for him, but now they're like, he's kind of weak. He's a puppet. He's being controlled by the far left. And I do wonder if this perception of weakness is why he hasn't gotten more of a rally around the flag bump. And the thing about the weakness is people talk about his age a lot in the focus groups. There's just this man, he doesn't have his fastball, his finger of the pulse. And sometimes I just feel like we got to have real talk where it's yeah, he's an old guy. Can he be strong in these moments? It's a tough lift for a guy who's in 78 years old.
Maybe even more so really though than age is I think he's a creature of the Senate. And I think the Senate is about talking and compromise. And I think one of the things that voters in these groups and in other groups that I've seen, they want to see some fight. They want to see some strength. They want to see some forcefulness. I'm struck by the fact that maybe the most memorable speech he gave, the most forceful speech he gave was a couple weeks ago in Warsaw. And the administration walked part of that back moments after it was done. So I do think voters are looking for the president to lead. I think the voters are looking for a display of strength. And I think it's something that it's mentioned not just by swing voters, it's mentioned by Democrats. Obviously, they want to see a slightly different strength argument or strength demonstration. But I do think a strong president is defined by strength. And I think right now he's not defined by that.
What do you make, though, of the specific thing, like why he's not getting more of a rally around the flag bump? He's done a very steady job with Ukraine, and it feels like he should be getting higher marks, and he's not.
It's a great question. I think a lot of it is just the general polarization that we live in. I feel like we're so conditioned to thinking that in reality, the political world is 50-50. And I think it's just hard to break out of 50-50 in a lot of ways. And it's half a world away. I don't know that it's as top of mind for many people. They see and feel the ramifications of it in gas and grocery prices. So I think it cross-pressures a lot of voters as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's get into your wheelhouse, communications. Because the one thing that both groups of these voters agree on, and we've been seeing this in focus groups for months, is the messaging from the White House. And really the whole administration is just not working. And maybe it's because we got used to a president who tried to and did dominate the news cycle. But voters tell us all the time that they simply do not hear enough from Biden or from Kamala Harris. And when they do communicate, so people have this sense that things don't seem transparent. And in this kind of conspiracy-minded world we live in, that seems to wig people out a little bit. Let's listen to the swing voters first.
I'd like to see more communication, to know what's going on more behind the scenes, not just on the polished briefings. So, having more of a mouthpiece that actually gets heard.
When Trump was president, he was always on Twitter, always on YouTube. And I feel like as soon as that got cut off, whether it be a good thing or bad thing, the way he was behaving, the fact that he was able to communicate to all of us his ideas, I feel like was something helpful. And I feel since the new administration has taken on, there hasn't been a lot of transparency, and that's leaving me to feel insecure and not wanting to move forward, if that makes sense.
So that's swing voters, but it's the Democrats have even tougher words on this. Listen to this.
He needs to be more clear with how he's presenting information, and I think that will really help.
Sometimes I get disappointed in him not standing behind some stuff. At first I actually really liked his statement of saying this man shouldn't be in power, and then everybody backtracking as soon as he got pushback. That was something I really admired about and thought was funny about him when he was with Obama, is he kind of would always slip up and just say what was on his mind.
But I think he can do more limited, targeted messaging himself. And I really feel like the White House has to get their act together and not send out mixed messages, which has been happening.
He's the explainer in chief. And I think as Democrats, our messaging is lousy. And the fact that we may lose the midterms and who we're running against, it's almost inconceivable. How are we losing to these guys?
Robert, as a former Republican who is really concerned about the state of the Republican Party and thinks that they've completely lost their minds, I also would like to reiterate that question from that man. It's how could you be losing to these guys? Yeah. And part of that is I just hear it all the time from the focus groups. They just don't feel like they see Biden, hear Biden, feel like he's leading, got his hand on the wheel. So the value of strong, visible communications.
Right.
Why don't we hear more from Biden? What is the strategy here? Are they trying to hide him? What's going on?
Well, I think, I don't think this has ever truly been Biden's strong suit, right? And I'm not surprised that people want to hear more, right? I think the cadence of messaging, you hear it in these focus groups, and I hear it from both voters and friends. They want to see Biden out there more. Unlike that one swing voter who wanted Trump back on Twitter, which that I don't hear a lot of. But to some degree, I think they do expect this idea. And I remember, President Obama used to say, I don't expect everybody to agree with me, but if they hear me talk about a decision, at least they'll understand why. And so I think we need to see an increased cadence of communication. We need to see more statements. We need to see more of the president, more interviews. Again, I think the challenge is they just have never been Biden's strong suit. And I think part of the challenge then is figuring out, if not Biden, then more of who, right? And you heard it in the groups. They don't feel or hear it or see it from the vice president. Nobody else gets mentioned. But I do think, and I think it plays into a lot of these arguments, whether it's strength, whether it's expectations. I just think not being on the field is hurting the White House.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you brought this up about everybody else. I just think this is such a key point. It is unfair to expect this all from Biden. Like, yes, I understand people want to hear more from Biden, but like, it could be anybody. There could be all kinds of people that they deputize to, like, please go carry these messages. I come from the Republican communications world, and the idea of creating your own echo chamber is sort of a central thesis around how you communicate. And Democrats, as somebody who's recently started rooting for you guys, I'm just sometimes like, what is the comm strategy here? Like, where are all the other people? Where's the bench? Because it feels like there should be a surrogate army trying to push a particular narrative. It shouldn't all be on Biden.
No, it absolutely shouldn't be. And President Obama used to say that to us too. I can't be the only person out here. Look, in fairness to Biden and to Obama then, Democrats have never been particularly good at the echo chamber. Republicans, far, far better. I remember back in 2009, 2010, we were battling MSNBC not being lifted by MSNBC, particularly in a way that Republicans get an assist from Fox. So I don't think our surrogate bench has ever been particularly well developed. And then in an era now where the expectation is higher, and I think, quite frankly, so too are the amount of avenues. I talked about the news ecosystem changing. There is the ability now through digital communications to provide, hey, I don't have to watch the whole State of the Union. I can just watch a clip. I can just watch a clip of this speech. I can just see a blurb here. I definitely think that it's something that the White House has got to do more to figure out, whether it is lifting the vice president, whether it's lifting members of the cabinet up. I wonder, on Ukraine, should there be some person that we think of as more of the face of the American effort in Ukraine if it's not the president? And so I think it's a big, big thing for them and, high up on a to-do list going forward.
Well, it's not all bad news. I do think, if you ask people do like Biden. I mean, let's listen to them talk about what they think his strengths are.
The one thing that I like about President Biden, and I liked about him when he was Vice President Biden, is his humanism. He's rational. He's tried to include everyone and, isn't belittling people along the party lines, kind of like Trump had. He's authentic and endearing to me. And I believe that he truly cares about our country.
He brings the human element to his role as a leader for the country. He includes people. He's more positive than negative.
I like that Joe Biden he's a centrist. He tries to pull people together. He's like a peacemaker.
He's a gentleman. And I appreciate the fact that he's a gentleman and he's statesmanlike. And it's what you want. He looks like a president. It's what you want. Unfortunately, he's in a world that isn't like that. It's really a shame.
I guess this is the thing that I find maybe just a little befuddling is that people think he's like a great guy, I do wonder, like we just said, it shouldn't all be on Biden, but it feels like if he was out there more just kind of doing his Joe Biden thing of, hey man, I feel your pain and I'm with you, that would be a real asset because people like him as a human.
Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt that, humanity and empathy are the essence of who Joe Biden is. And I don't, when I say get out there in communications, it doesn't have to be 30-minute deep foreign policy speeches. I think, a little bit of letting Joe be Joe is a good thing. I think seeing that passion, and I think what will also come through is some of that strength. I was struck by, as you mentioned, and I think this is where in those groups, when those former Trump 2016 voters are asked if they want to go back to Trump, Nobody said yes. And to me, I think that's where you see this come through, this humanity and empathy. They understand that they may not have the perfect person in Joe Biden as president right now, but they have enough that they like that they don't want to go back. And I think that will be important as we go forward.
Well, let's talk about that going forward, because you are 100% right. I don't think I do swing voters constantly, these Trump to Biden voters, and I'm not sure I've ever had somebody say they regretted their vote. Maybe it's happened, because usually at least there's an outlier, but like mostly people are like, nope, I'm fine. I'm fine with what I did. I'm mad at Biden about XYZ, but I did no more Trump. But that, of course, begs the question about 2024, where there's a part of me that thinks 2023 is going to be one of the most interesting years in our political lifetime, which is weird because it's an off year, but it is when we are going to figure out whether we literally rerun the 2020 election with two septuagenarians. I mean, two just very old men who've already done it before, and like we just rerun that whole thing, or the whole thing breaks wide open and Joe Biden doesn't run again and Trump doesn't run again. You've got two parties kind of trying to figure out who the next generation of them is going to be. But one of the interesting things in the focus groups, and this was in this one, you ask them, hey, do you want to see Joe Biden run again? And people say no. They're like, no, he's too old. You don't want him to run again. But then you ask Democrats especially, okay, well, if not Joe Biden, who would you like to see run? And they just stare at you. And I guess this is what I mean about the surrogates too, is like, where are all the other people that you could get used to be like, who might make a good president? That person.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you are struck a bit by that. And look, I think part of that is when a party controls the White House, it is hard to see and showcase a lot of others who would be president. So that was a little interesting to watch. They did certainly have concerns about age. And that part also, again, kind of interesting. Look, I think if you think about the Republicans, you've got to almost, if you're a Republican, hope Donald Trump doesn't run again. Because if he does, it's hard for me to see how he's not the nominee. And if he is the nominee, watching these focus groups leads me to think it's going to be hard for him to get elected president again, because the people that flip their vote, nobody's looking to go back. They may not, as you said, be in love with Joe Biden. They may not even really know who the next Democratic candidate will be, but they have made up their mind on Donald Trump, and that's not likely to change. So I agree. 2023 will be fascinating to see what happens, what decision Joe Biden makes, how they use Kamala Harris in the next 2 years. How do they raise her profile? Whether or not he's running for re-election or not, I think will be all a set of fascinating off-year questions in a way that most of the time you don't watch an incumbent president have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting, this thing about they're not going back to Trump. That's true. If you reran it again, although, the turnout made such a big difference. I wonder how it would go. I'm not sure that Donald Trump couldn't win a general election again, fair and square against Biden right at this moment. I'm fighting with a lot of Republicans right now. There's a lot of my friends in sort of the never again Trump world who have a magnifying glass out looking for all this evidence of Trump's grip slipping on the party. And I don't think that evidence is there.
No.
I think it's more wish casting than anything else.
Undoubtedly.
Don't you think that Trump, A, wants to run again, and B, controls the Republican Party, and he'd win absolutely if he ran?
I don't see any evidence that he wouldn't be the nominee if he ran. If I was betting whether he'd be reelected president, I would bet no. But I don't see who's going to beat him for the nomination. I don't see that the nominating process would do anything but help Donald Trump. And, all these people will say, well, we could get somebody who has sort of the beliefs and the passion of Donald Trump without the packaging of Donald Trump. The challenge that I always say to Republicans is, walk me through how somebody's a better Donald Trump than Donald Trump. Because I watched it at the end of 2016 in the nominating race when Marco Rubio tried to be Donald Trump or tried to be better than Donald Trump at being Donald Trump. And he wasn't particularly good at it. And Ted Cruz was actually quite awful at it. Yeah, maybe he's not going to win a few races in which he's endorsing in. That's same was true for Barack Obama. I don't see that the grip is any less strong than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Well, this is where Trump influence question gets really interesting because, like, the answer to your question is like, who's going to be a better Trump than Trump? Like, kind of Ron DeSantis. And the focus groups, right along with the polling, all say the exact same thing. If you ask people in the focus groups, if you say to Republicans, hey, Trump's not going to run, who do you want to see run? They all say DeSantis first, but they also say Kristi Noem, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Tim Scott. Not a lot of Mike Pence fans or not too many Nikki Haley's, but occasionally you get them. No Rubios, no Chris Christie's. And when people say that they don't want Trump to run again, it's not very often because they don't like him. It's actually because they just don't think he can win or that he is also too old. And they're just worried too many people hate him. And so then they kind of default to the DeSantis model. But DeSantis he's a compromise in which the Overton window has moved 1,000 steps Trumpward. You know, where like the establishment can like, I guess, stomach it because they all seem to want him. Like that's what they think is a good idea for the next step. But there's no doubt that Ron DeSantis has just totally encompassed the whole yelling at the media, being all grievance, all culture war all the time. So like that's the one guy who's kind of doing Trump light.
Yeah, I agree. I think for him to be the nominee, it would take, to me, Trump not running. Because again, I don't think Ron DeSantis is going to out-Trump Donald Trump.
Yeah. Let me ask you just one last question, though. That's interesting in light of listening to all these swing voters who are just pretty frustrated with Biden. You know, I saw an opportunity in 2020 for Dems to kind of cement the political realignment that seems to be happening where, you know, they're kind of trading white working class voters, union voters who are culturally more MAGA for these college educated suburban voters who probably voted for Romney and McCain, but either voted for Hillary Clinton or took a flyer on Trump and then were like, absolutely not, never again. And that group of voters, like they hate Trump. They hate the party getting more Trump-y. They voted for Biden. And like you could have seen the Democrats kind of owning them from here on out. But I'm worried that in 2022, those are the backsliders because of COVID, because of inflation, because of frustrations with Biden, that they kind of come back and vote for Republicans. What do you think of that? Like, what audience of voters should the White House be courting going into 2022?
I think what you said is got to keep the political office and most of the rest of the offices in the White House up sleepless at night, because I worry those voters could backslide because they just feel like they haven't seen enough progress, or just as bad, they just don't participate. They decide they're not going to vote. I was heartened a bit watching the Democrats in these focus groups. Yeah, they gave Biden pretty strong grades. And I felt like the Democrats in the group were still going to be enthusiastic enough in this election. Whether or not there's enough of them, there's a natural drop-off in off-year voting. And so the question is, can you figure out a way not to have that drop-off? I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. So to worry about both the base and that group of swing voters, look, that's why if you were betting right now, and if you had been for the last few months, you'd bet that Republicans are going to have a pretty good night in November and take over the House.
The one thing that I'll say that, you know, there's a real opportunity for Democrats is I'm not sure if you've looked across this field of Republican candidates just yet, but they're putting up some real interesting folks in a bunch of these races. And they are people who are basically running on platforms that say the election was stolen, and they are sort of anti-vax. I mean, they are outside of the mainstream for a lot of these swing voters. And so for me, it's interesting to hear the swing voters. They're down on Biden, but I do think the question is can you get them to vote for a Carrie Lake? Can you get them to vote for a Herschel Walker, Eric Greitens, or a Josh Mandel? You know, like these are, it depends on how the field shapes up, but candidates do matter, and Republicans are not sending us their best, as they say.
Yeah, it's why I mentioned the House, but not the Senate yet in terms of favoring Republicans.
Yes.
Because I think there's a lot of these statewide races where both the nominees and the campaigns they run are going to really matter. 2010 and 2012 showed at least several states Republicans should have won statewide races that didn't because they had bad candidates, right? Harry Reid might have lost in 2010. Claire McCaskill might have lost in 2012 were it not for really bad Republican candidates that were at a step in a year, particularly in 2010 when Democrats weren't all that popular. And so I think the nominees in a lot of these statewide races and the campaigns that both Republicans and Democrats run are going to be hugely important to the outcome. I think there's very little about a statewide race that's predetermined right now.
Well, when these primaries come around the corner, maybe you can come back and talk to us as we get in, because we'll certainly be talking to undecided voters.
I'm happy to come back and watch more swing voters talk about CPI.
Well, Robert Gibbs, thanks so much for being here. And thank you for listening to the Focus Group podcast. Make sure to go give us a rating on iTunes and tell all your friends about it. Thanks. We'll see you next time.